On a crisp, bitterly cold December 4th, 3 weeks after we had entered the forest, the battered remains of the 22nd Infantry, plus its frightened replacements, boarded the usual 2.5-ton 646 trucks for our 75-mile trip to a quiet sector of the front lines in Luxembourg. We were told no fighting had occurred there since September, and that we could R&R there and obtain more replacements. For the few of us who had survived the Hurtgen, it was as delicious and unbelievable as a release from a long prison sentence. No longer did we have to flinch from the scream of artillery and its shattering explosions. No longer were we forced to wonder if the next minute would be our last. The relief was so overpowering, yet once again I found myself fighting back tears of grief for our terrible losses. As the convoy headed out, mine was the dubious honour of riding in the open jeep of the commanding officer of F Company. Still below half strength with its 76 souls, of whom 66 were new recruits the final day of the Hurtgen, F Company limped away from the scene of one of the nastiest battlefields of World War II. According to Army records, our heaviest losses in Europe occurred there. The convoy covered over 100 miles, passing through many villages and small towns, and then Luxembourg City itself. I can understand why so many of us have returned to those battlefields, for there is where we came of age, there is where we went through our rite of passage. I recall names such as Zweifel, Eupen, Uffalize, Bastogne, and Arlon. Under other circumstances, and perhaps in the early fall when the hardwoods were in full colour, it could have been a most enjoyable, scenic excursion. Now it was dreary, grey, bleak, cold, miserable winter. Convoy travel was usually irritatingly slow and fitful. No one along the line ever knew why there had to be so many stops, why the convoy couldn't get going again quickly. The halts were always exasperating, particularly since we knew there probably was no other traffic, certainly not civilian. It took us all day to travel about 100 miles. At least when we were stalled, the wind wasn't so bad. Once we started up again, the wind whipped through the open cabs of the trucks and the jeeps, and bit right down to the marrow. It had never seemed that cold when we went hunting in the freezing wilds of Michigan, though we were better dressed then and weren't riding in open cars. My feet were so icy that they began to hurt. They weren't in particularly good shape. I hadn't been able to change socks or even take my shoes off for 3 weeks. Finally, I had to do something about it. Perhaps my actions made a little history. I am probably the only one ever to have built a fire on the floor of a moving jeep. I simply emptied a K-ration box and set fire to the wax box. This helped my hands, but I couldn't get my feet over the fire long enough to help. The driver looked at me a little strangely but didn't say anything. Forwarding units had gone ahead the previous day to arrange our exchange of position with the 331st Regiment of the 83rd Infantry Division, and my company wound up near the Moselle River in Luxembourg, about 12 miles southeast of Luxembourg City. My command post was in Oberdonwen, Luxembourg. We were now part of a sector of the German Western Front known as the Ardennes, which 2 weeks later became part of the Battle of the Bulge. For almost 4 months, as though by tacit agreement, there had been little activity, except for occasional minor patrols just to keep an eye on the area. For us, it would be a rest and training area. We were just a shell of the old 22nd Infantry, and we would now rebuild, train the new men, and absorb them into a fighting unit. We hoped. In the same area, the rest of the 4th Division had very loose defensive positions along a 25-mile stretch of the Luxembourg-German border, west of German troops facing the Sauer and Moselle rivers. Each rifle company covered at least a mile of the front. My F Company had an exceptionally large area. By road it was over 5 miles from one of our outposts to the company command post. In addition, we had several outposts between which we had to keep patrols roving. The terrain was rugged, with many winding roads, steep slopes and deep valleys. There were many gaps in our defence, and it would not have been difficult for the Germans to penetrate quite a distance into our territory without being stopped. Our line was very weak. At best, it would only be an early warning system. We were not the only ones so vulnerable, for the entire 75 miles of the sector was held by divisions chewed up in the Hurtgen that were then only at token strength. What we were doing was apparently the only thing that could be done with such damaged divisions, and no one seemed overly concerned. The Allied High Command was well aware of the circumstances and took the calculated risk. To me, it was a most unaccustomed luxury to live in bare, unheated houses. It might be cold sleeping on the floor, but it was dry and out of the wind and weather. We also had kitchens with us, and regular hot meals were a sumptuous treat the new men did not yet appreciate. Once all the men had been housed and fed, I decided it was time to look after myself. After 3 weeks of the dirtiest sort of existence in the Hurtgen and a long nasty convoy, I was somewhat ripe. I asked the cooks if they could scare up some hot water for me. They scrounged around and came up with an old 10-gallon copper tub in which they heated water on the gas kitchen range. They carried this marvellous bathing contraption upstairs into one of the vacant rooms. I dropped my old clothes in a heap and crammed as much of myself as possible into the warm water. Very soon the heat began to defrost my poor feet, and the pain became so severe that I had to get out of my wonderful tub and change quickly into clean clothes. Then I shaved off 3 weeks' growth and went down the stairs, where I was met with the nervous stares of men who wondered who this resplendent new officer might be. My feet were so swollen the next day that I couldn't get my shoes on. They continued to hurt for an entire week. Colonel Keenan sent the battalion surgeon over to examine me. He rubbed my feet a little, gave me some Epsom salts, and told me to soak in hot water as much as possible. I was still without a second in command. I asked Colonel Keenan if I could have Lieutenant Lee Lloyd, my old friend from E Company. The colonel arranged the transfer. Lieutenant Lloyd took over at once as my executive officer, running the patrols and outposts, and also all the company details while I was still struggling with my poor feet. Toward the end of the week, when I was able to move again, Lieutenant Lloyd took me on a jeep tour of our lines. All I could do was shake my head at the futility of ever having to defend our position against serious attack, should it come to that. Oberdonwen was a very old, typical Middle European village. The farmers' houses and barns were more or less backed up against one another for mutual protection, and the surrounding land was farmed in all directions. Unlike the usual American practice, isolated farm homes were rare in much of Europe. I would have guessed that at least 100 people normally lived in that communal village. All had decamped, except for the Catholic priest and a few of his helpers. They stayed in the convent, apparently living off supplies stored in the cellars. They were not at all friendly, possibly out of wariness for the Germans so close to the border, possibly because of the normal fear and resentment toward any invaders, so we left them alone. We were living in their homes, after all, yet they were not our hosts. We had not had any enemy action at all in that part of the line. It was therefore something of a surprise to learn from Colonel Kennan that we were to be pulled back even farther behind the lines. 2nd Battalion was now regimental reserve, and we came back a few miles into the Schrossig-Mautfurt area, where we occupied some barracks-like buildings. The buildings were heated and had hot showers, and though they were not fancy, we loved them. On December 14th, Colonel Keenan phoned to tell me that he thought I ought to take a few days off. It seems that regiment had acquired a nice house in Luxembourg City, supplied a cook, and set it up as a temporary escape for those most needing a change. At first I wasn't particularly interested, because I already had passable living quarters, and being somewhat conservative, I wasn't wild about floating in liquor or chasing women. Not that I disapproved for others. The colonel insisted, however, and sent over a jeep and driver to pick me up. I knew I couldn't have left the company in better hands than Lieutenant Lloyd's, so off I went for a few days' rest and recreation. The winding blacktop road went through some picturesque villages and pretty countryside. After a short while we came upon the pleasant view of the city on its rather high plateau some miles ahead. We went almost up to the main business section. The driver stopped before an imposing, modern 2-story brick home and said, "This is it, sir." There I was greeted by 4 other officers from the 22nd, none of whom I'd met before. Our sole bond was that we'd had our fill of the Hurtgen, and probably had no business having survived it. We respected one another because of the horrible experiences we had shared. Luxembourg was a rather large, beautiful old city, after Paris by far the biggest I'd seen on the continent. Even though it was shelled every day for months by a German railroad gun about 12 miles away, it seemed a most peaceful, tranquil retreat from a very distant war. After settling my few belongings in the lovely wallpapered room assigned to me, I stretched out blissfully for a short nap on the big double bed. I couldn't believe it. A real bed with a genuine mattress, white pillows, and white linen. It was only a short walk downtown. We all went out together to see the sights. The local citizens were all openly friendly, and many of them spoke English. School children also spoke to us freely. English was a required subject in the schools. As part of my adjustment to civilian ways, I treated myself to a dish of ice cream and a movie. It was an old Western with the soundtrack in French and subtitles in English. I couldn't wait to try out my warm, comfortable bed, and it did give me a night's delicious sleep. Hot pancakes and syrup for breakfast was another treat. Good coffee, table and chairs, and silverware made the whole meal a delight. The next day we met 4 very nice fighter pilots over coffee in one of the little cafes. We compared notes and had a great time talking with them. There was not the slightest bit of envy or rivalry. They even offered us a chance to shower in their quarters, not realizing we had our own. We parted with friendly waves and mutual encouragement to keep up the good work. It was a bit of a shock to find my battalion jeep driver waiting for me when I returned to quarters. He had orders from Colonel Keenan to get me back to my company at once because of activity on the front. My R&R thus ended abruptly, and I headed back to what had by then become, for me, the real world. 2nd Battalion was in its usual turmoil, everyone scurrying around, getting packed for a quick move. Colonel Kennan told me to get right down to my company. He said the only information he had so far was that the Germans had made a sizable attack against the 12th Infantry. The 4th Infantry Division had 3 basic infantry regiments, the 8th, 12th, and 22nd. As the 22nd Infantry Reserve Battalion, we were temporarily assigned to the 12th Infantry. We would be fully briefed once we got on the scene. It was December 17th, barely 2 weeks since we had pulled ourselves out of the Hurtgen Forest Holocaust, and we were about to be thrown into something again. I worried about how unseasoned F Company was. With only 4 officers and 84 men, the company was 80 men short of full strength as well. Thanks to Lieutenant Lloyd, the company was already mounted in trucks and ready to move when I arrived. In 45 minutes we arrived at the assembly area about a quarter-mile south of Beck, along the road to Berberg, and I hurriedly joined the other company commanders for a briefing. Colonel Kennan told us the 12th Infantry had been hit pretty hard along most of its front, and that a fierce battle had developed at Echternach on the left front. German units were known to have bypassed Osweiler in the centre and Dickweiler on the right. The Allied High Command had gambled by using a very thin defensive line along the Belgian, Luxembourg and German borders. Only 5 divisions defended the entire 75-mile front, which would take at least 12 divisions to defend properly, and none of them was ready for combat. The 106th Division was fresh from the States and had no combat experience. Many of its weapons were still in crates. The 1st, 4th, 28th and 90th Divisions had taken part in the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest and were at about half strength. It is easy to understand why many units were overrun in the initial fighting. One company of the 12th Infantry was trapped in Osweiler. Our main objective would be to attack at once and get to Osweiler to rescue that company. The colonel asked if any of us had ever fought with tanks. I waited while no one spoke up and then admitted to having been in the Saint-Lô breakthrough. So he gave my company the job of working with a company of tanks from the 19th Tank Battalion of the 9th Armoured Division. The colonel's plan was for a 2-pronged advance on Osweiler, with the main body of the battalion, companies E, G, H and headquarters, approaching directly southeast along the road to Osweiler, and with F Company going south 1 mile to Berberg to pick up the tank company, and then heading eastward through Herben to Osweiler, see map. I was cautioned that the Germans might already be near Berberg. Within a few minutes we were on the way to Berberg, about 1/2 mile south, where the tanks were waiting. As soon as I'd assigned men to ride each tank, we took off for Herben, our first objective, 3/4 of a mile to the east. Everything was peaceful and normal until we went through Herben, and then we passed several dead GIs on a small ridge to our right. Judging by the positions they had fallen in, my guess was that they'd been gunned down by an armoured vehicle rather than by foot soldiers. And this made us even more cautious as we followed the blind bends in the winding road. The weather thickened to a heavy fog, with visibility down to about 200 yards, even on open ground. When we came to the sloping fields just west of Osweiler, we sent tanks and infantry a few hundred yards to the left and right to probe. We found a platoon of Germans in the fields to the left and took them prisoner. They had spotted us beforehand, however, and had already called down artillery. Now they were trapped in their own fire and seemed quite happy to join us behind the shelter of our tanks. The artillery couldn't follow our movements in the fog, and this spared us a lot of shelling. The fog began to thin a little, particularly on the higher ground, and my naturally cautious nature made me suggest to the tank captain that he break out the bright orange panels to be put on the backs of our tanks to identify us to friendly aircraft. The tank man didn't think it necessary, saying, "Those guys can't fly in this soup." He was probably right, I thought. I was on the ground to the left of the road, directing some of my men in the handling of the prisoners, when I heard the roar of plane motors. 4 American P-47 fighter bombers began to swoop down on our tanks and men on the hill, 300 yards to the right of the road. The first 3 planes came diving in at very low altitude, but when almost on top of the tanks, they pulled up abruptly, wagged their wings, and flew away. The 4th plane, unaccountably, cut loose his bombs about 100 yards from 2 of our tanks, and his napalm bombs scored direct hits, engulging the tanks. Orange flames shot up from every part of the tanks and surrounding ground, and black smoke rose in an ugly cloud that drifted away. The 2 tanks were lost. All the men in them and those close by were killed almost instantly. Napalm burns all the oxygen out of the air and causes quick suffocation. It was over in a few seconds, and we couldn't do anything except watch helplessly. The tank captain ordered the orange panels displayed at once. Thanks to the partial concealment of the fog and the lack of much enemy resistance, we made it into Osweiler about 2 o'clock that afternoon, December 17th. A few survivors from L Company of the 12th Infantry were holed up in town, and their lieutenant seemed quite relieved to collect them and march them back down the road to Berberg. When I radioed Colonel Kanan that we had secured Osweiler, he told me to set up the strongest possible defence and be very alert for counterattacks. We would be on our own, he said, because the rest of the battalion had been attacked and was fighting against a very stubborn enemy. The main battle was about a half-mile northwest of us, to our left rear, and we could hear all the shooting. I knew we'd be in jeopardy if the 2nd Battalion was annihilated. Osweiler was another typical small farm community. Its sturdy brick and stone houses occupied a small valley with open hills on all sides. Most of the houses seemed to have good cellars, which were where we would live because of the artillery. Our main concerns were the 3 roads coming into town from the east and south. Lieutenant Lloyd and I climbed up to the top of a 5-story narrow wooden school building to get a better view, and we could see the open hills clearly for about 300 yards, but had no idea what lay beyond. According to our map, Dickweiler was about 3/4 of a mile south of us, near the Sauer River. The nearest patch of woods, about a 1/4 mile north, bordered a ravine or valley near Rodenhof and spread westward beyond where the 2nd Battalion was in battle. We were so exposed and vulnerable on all sides that I realized we'd have to send out patrols so we'd at least get some warning of attacks. First, we placed in position the tanks we needed to defend the roads, and kept the rest of the tanks in mobile reserve for emergencies. Then we placed the riflemen and our light machine guns and mortars in houses close to the tanks to give them support. Every man had his job. After dark, the tank captain became a little restless, and decided to pull his tanks out of town and back 2 miles to Berberg, because, he said, they needed gas. I tried to persuade him to stay, but it was a delicate situation. I was in command of the small combat team, yet he was my superior in rank. He therefore decided to ignore my persuasions, so I was forced to radio Colonel Keenan. The colonel got the captain on the radio and told him to move no more than 2 tanks at a time to the rear for gas. The captain protested that it would be too dangerous to send 2 tanks by themselves, and also that it would take too long. The colonel then told him to have his gas trucks meet him halfway, but that under no circumstances was he to move more than 2 tanks at a time to be filled up. The captain had to comply, but he was mad as hell. His mood didn't bother me, because all I cared about was defending the town. I needed those tanks. The 2nd Battalion was unable to disengage itself from the Germans all night. Early the next morning, December 18th, Colonel Keenan ordered me to send a platoon of tanks and some infantry to release the entrapped battalion. Visibility was still poor due to the heavy fog, so poor that our tanks accidentally opened fire on the leading elements of G Company. Later I learned that G Company's Greenlee saved what could have been a tragedy by running toward the tanks and waving his maps. Because of the extra firepower of the tanks, the Germans were driven far enough back to allow the 2nd Battalion to break through the Germans and join the rest of us in Osweiler. Colonel Kennan quickly reinforced our defences and sent out patrols north, east and south. No contacts were made, so we had an enjoyable, peaceful night. Next day, Colonel Keenan called a meeting of company commanders and for the first time was able to give us an idea of what was happening. At the time, and even to this day, it was pretty damned scary. These were not strong combat patrols or company or battalion strength attacks we were getting. Rather, a whole big section of the German front had erupted in a massive, desperate surprise offensive. We happened to be at the southern edge of a huge German spearhead, and it was utterly vital that we hold our ground and thus force the German penetration northwestward, away from the critical airfields and supply depots of Luxembourg. At about this time, Division G2, Intelligence, had information that the Germans had a pontoon bridge across the Sauer River, about 3/4 of a mile to our northeast. 2 brave volunteers took a long-range radio and went through our lines and on into the hills beyond. Their mission was to direct artillery fire onto the bridge, and cold as it was, they stayed out a couple of nights giving the Germans fits. Finally, they were forced to return home when the Germans began to send out search patrols that were getting awfully close. That was some tough mission, and my hat was off to those 2 men. 2nd Battalion was still attached to the 12th Infantry Regiment. Their commander, Colonel Chance, needed more information, so he ordered us to send patrols to greater distances. Therefore, on December 19th, Lieutenant Lloyd led a patrol northward toward Rodenhof. The fog had thickened, and visibility was down to less than 100 yards at midday. Lieutenant Lloyd returned with his patrol in about an hour. Less than a half-mile out of town, and just west of Rodenhof, he had found a large concentration of Germans. Colonel Keenan immediately relayed this intelligence to Colonel Chance, who apparently was not much of a conservative, for he just as quickly ordered Colonel Keenan to leave his strong defensive position in Osweiler and get out and attack those Germans that very day. As I should have expected, the colonel ordered my company to move out first on foot, with Lieutenant Lloyd leading us to the head of a small valley just a couple of 100 yards southwest of Rodenhof. We were to take up positions facing north and to begin firing on the ridge directly in front of us at 4 p.m. From our positions on the forward slope of the ridge, we would be firing at the Germans across a valley about 200 yards wide. This firing was intended as a diversion to keep the Germans occupied, while the main attack swung in from my left rear and then continued straight ahead through the valley and ridge into Rodenhof. My company's firing was, of course, to stop on signal as the attack advanced. Lieutenant Lloyd led us to our firing positions without confusion and without detection. We were there in plenty of time. At exactly 1600 hours, we commenced firing across the small valley. Due to the heavy fog, it was impossible to tell just where our barrage of bullets was going and what effect, if any, it might be having on the unseen enemy. Certainly the shooting made a tremendous noise and must have given the Germans the impression of a powerful attack coming their way. At 4 p.m. companies, E and G jumped off abreast. As they advanced, we clearly heard the staccato barking and ripping of German machine guns. E and G must have been meeting very stiff resistance, in part due to the vicious enemy fire, in part due to inability to maneuver in the fog. Our battalion attack soon petered out. Both attack companies were still back 200 yards on my left flank when they began to dig in. With the attack aborted, we were isolated way off on the right flank of the battalion. Thank goodness for the experience and the cautious nature of Lieutenant Lloyd and myself, for we didn't just stand around waiting for battalion to make another move or give us orders. Instead, we had our men dig in at once as deeply as they could. We were down to about 60 men, or about 1/3 full strength, and we shaped our defence in a rough horseshoe, reaching to the edge of the woods at the top of the ridge we were on. The hardwoods gave us some protection and a feeling of comfort and security we sorely needed. The area to our right and to our rear, beyond the edge of the ridge, was wide open farmland. We also decided to place a small outpost on our left flank, between us and E Company. The late afternoon light was quickly fading, and we'd managed to get our foxholes down only about a foot, when the men on the outpost rushed in yelling, "Germans!" The Krauts came right in on their heels, firing rapidly, and one of the outpost men was the first casualty. For the next half hour we had some of the toughest small arms fighting I'd ever been in, and I was proud our new men held on so well. These were very stubborn, determined Germans, and they kept right on coming. By then it was completely dark. We couldn't see the enemy, and they couldn't see us. We kept firing at the flashes of their rifles and burp guns. Every now and then we could see a shadow moving. We had the advantage, for a change, in that we were partly below ground and were firing slightly downhill. Also, we were able to toss out grenades as the Germans got closer, and they must have been very damaging to the exposed enemy. For some reason, the Krauts didn't use grenades on us. We were lucky. This was a life-and-death situation, and we didn't have time to think, only to react. The constant explosions of rifle fire and the mad drumming of the burp guns wore on our nerves, but we couldn't stop fighting. When the Krauts were in real close, within 15 or 20 yards, they began to yell something that sounded like, "Kamerad, Hände hoch!" Lieutenant Lloyd knew German and told me they were yelling at us to surrender and come out with our hands up. I said to tell them to go to hell, so he yelled back what sounded like, "Nix, you Schweinehund." This made them furious, and for the next few minutes they gave us all they had, while we ducked low and fired back. Suddenly the Germans shot up 2 small white flares, and we were caught in the glare. I was sure it was to mark us for artillery, and I began to think in terms of moving somewhere, but it must have been a signal to withdraw, because the firing ended abruptly, and the Germans disappeared. We checked everyone and found we had 1 dead, 4 wounded, and 1 missing. All the wounded were able to walk back by themselves to the aid station in Osweiler. One man didn't look or act like a seriously wounded man as he walked up and asked if he could go to the aid station. When I asked where he was hit, he opened his shirt and showed me a bullet hole, and then turned around to show me where it came out his back. It had missed his heart by very little. He said he was positive he could make it to Osweiler with the other wounded, so I sent them on their way. They all made it. The body of the missing man was found later by Graves registration. Apparently he had taken off during the heat of the battle, and in trying to find safety had run into some Germans instead. Many weeks later, when his folks wrote me for details of his death, I simply told them that he had died quickly from bullet wounds. Now that the Germans had left, we went back to completing our foxholes. No one needed urging. We were out of grenades and low on ammunition, but fortunately the enemy didn't know how vulnerable we were, and they left us alone all night. Within an hour, new supplies of grenades and ammunition arrived, so we felt a little more secure. Of course, I didn't know we'd be undisturbed, so the balance of the night passed very slowly for me. I studied every shadow, every movement of the wind, every noise of the field and forest for warning of the enemy. My nerves would not relax. With the first faint light of dawn, we made out some odd mounds or lumps to our front and left flanks, and these were German bodies. 2 of them were almost on top of us, only 5 to 10 yards out, and several others were scattered behind them. Someone said he'd counted 10 altogether, which seemed about right. Normally 7 or 8 are wounded for every man killed, so the grenades and all our firing might have accounted for 70 or 80 casualties, not including the KIAs left behind. We had probably been hit by a rifle company, though I doubt that in the darkness they were able to concentrate their strength on us. One of the bodies was that of a young, fair-haired lieutenant. Possibly the loss of this leader led to their withdrawal, for they had almost had us overrun. Fortunately for me, I did not know our true situation at the time. Sometime later I was looking at the tactical map, which showed F Company to be the absolute extreme tip of the entire Allied holding position at the lower southern edge of the Bulge. To our east and north were nothing but Germans. On the east was Germany itself. On the north was the 75-mile gap in our line made by the German penetration. The edge of this bulge ran roughly northwestward from my position and about 50 miles deep. To the south was Osweiler, held by Battalion Headquarters and H Company, plus a platoon from 3rd Battalion. Between us and Osweiler was a large gap through which the enemy could have encircled us at any time. Only to our west, with E and G companies, was there any reasonably close help. In our new line of defence, we were holding the bottom hinge to the gate the Germans had opened in our line, the one known as the Bulge. The defence of this small salient was still my responsibility, and my experience and Lieutenant Lloyd's came in very handy. Together we studied the terrain and the map, and we both felt the area east of Rodenhof was the most likely approach route for a major enemy attack. The only way we could stop the Germans in this hostile country was through artillery, so we carefully marked off and numbered on our map 20 of the most promising target areas they might attack, then radioed the coordinates back to our artillery. If we ever wanted to direct fire on those targets, we had only to pass to artillery the prearranged target number. We very thoroughly covered Rodenhof and its eastern approach valley. That done, we put it all aside and hoped we'd never have to use it. The weather suddenly became a vicious enemy. The soft, clean, beautifully white and pure snowflakes that the poets love so well settled down on us in abundance. Over a foot of this loveliness accumulated in 24 hours, and we were miserable. We had no shelter but had to keep pushing the stuff away to keep it from melting on us, and above all, on our weapons. Then the weather turned bitterly cold at night, dropping to as low as 10 below zero. Our hard-working and usually reliable supply people had not yet caught up to us with winter equipment. The trunks of our bodies were not too bad off, because we did have long johns, wool uniforms or fatigues, field jackets and wool overcoats. To keep warm, we wore everything we had. Our heads suffered, however, because all one had under the steel helmet besides the plastic liner was a small wool beanie. No earmuffs, no hood, no face covering, no scarf. Our hands also suffered with only wool finger gloves. No mittens, no outer shells. Of course, none of our things were fur-lined. The other extremities that were in trouble were our feet. We did have 4-buckle overshoes on top of our regular GI leather shoes, but we were very uncomfortable with only one pair of cotton socks. Worst of all were the long, cold nights when all we had were chilly foxholes, from which we'd scooped out the fresh snow. No blankets reached us, no shelter halves, no sleeping bags. We were undergoing the type of weather reserved for mountain troops or ski troops, but without their superb winter equipment. Winter wear did not reach us until early January 1945. Lastly, there was the general malaise of gradually losing one's resistance to everything, of never being able to get warm day after day after day. Perhaps there's a medical term for this ailment, but I think the word misery will do. It must be experienced to be understood. The merciless cold and our inability to move about and stimulate circulation soon led to a nasty new problem. Trench foot became near epidemic. This commonplace, rather colourless name hid the truly hideous nature of the disease. Cold, damp feet in tight boots caused poor circulation, and blood stopped flowing to toes and feet, causing tissue decay. And for many, unless circulation could be restored, the only remedy was amputation. Some victims lost toes, some lost a foot. For these people, the war was, in effect, over, and they were safe. But there was always the lingering, unprovable suspicion that some men deliberately gambled on this variation of Russian roulette. The battalion medics quickly sent us instructions on how to cope. We conducted daily foot inspections during which we looked for swelling or discoloration. We warned the men about tingling sensations or numbness, and urged them to massage their feet as much as possible. Of course, we explained that trench foot was only a problem of circulation, that the worst things were coldness, dampness, and the tourniquet effect of tight lacing, and everyone was issued an extra pair of socks and was ordered to change socks every day. Despite our precautions, we had our share of trench-foot casualties. Probably the most vulnerable man in the entire company was me. I'd only recovered from frostbite a few days before. After all the combat I'd been through, I was damned if I was going to set this example as a way to get out of the fighting. I rigidly followed the medic's suggestions. I didn't have soap, but I rinsed my feet in cold water in my helmet once a day, drying them with my old socks. Then I put on my fresh socks and washed out the old ones, wringing them as dry as possible, and then putting them inside my shirt against my body to dry. They had to be turned inside out several times, but they eventually did dry. This laundry method could have given me pneumonia, but fortunately it didn't. Water itself was a problem. We had only treated water brought up in 5-gallon cans from about 3 miles back. The cans were so cold that even during that short haul, ice formed on the surface. We usually got by on 2 canteens a day. The first canteen was for a warmish cup of coffee or chocolate in the morning, and for washing in our helmets. The second canteen had to last the rest of the day. Canteens that were carried in the normal position on the hip were useless because the water froze, so some of us got wise and carried our canteens under our coats, and thus had some water for later in the day. Some of the men ate snow directly, and some melted the ice by holding their canteens between their legs for a while. Since we were in such exposed positions on the front line, we were not able to build wood fires, and our only source of heat was the burning of our K-ration cartons, which were slightly larger than Cracker Jack boxes. Such cooking was a tricky business, and we learned it by trial and error. First, one got a cup of water. Then he got out of the wind in the foxhole and opened the ration box at one end only. Next, he used the key and slightly opened the can, which held eggs for breakfast, cheese for lunch, or meat for supper. Meanwhile, he emptied the other stuff out of the waxed carton and then lit it carefully at one end, nursing the flame to burn gradually around the lip of the box, just like a wick. With the oven going, one hung the partially open can of food by its key, which was hooked over the lip of the canteen cup, and carefully held both over the small flame. In the few minutes it took the fire to exhaust itself, a cup of coffee or chocolate became piping hot. The food got warm enough to eat, and one's hands thawed. As in most culinary art, little things made the difference. If, for instance, the K-ration box was stood on end and was turned to burn slowly, it would give off a good deal of heat. But when torn into pieces and gradually fed into the fire, it gave off very little heat. We also developed other refinements in the art of survival. Our foxholes were just wide enough for 2 men to sit up facing each other, with each one's feet shoved under the other guy's butt. They were deep enough to give our heads about a foot's clearance below ground level. In this way we escaped the surface wind, and also trapped enough warm breath and body heat for continued survival. At night we took our arms out of our coats and hugged our bodies, and that seemed to help. Perhaps, to complete the scene, it should be mentioned how we handled the normally routine calls of nature. This would become a particularly urgent personal problem during times of enemy action, such as shelling, or when the prevailing west wind was too penetrating and freezing to expose a bare derriere. Try it yourself sometime in a gale. The choice at times would be a form of constipation, or in cases of extreme emergency, measures too indelicate to mention. Somehow, and by some grace, most of us got through the beastly weather for 5 long days and 5 very long nights from December 19th to Christmas Eve, 1944. F Company's earlier role as decoy in 2nd Battalion's attack changed abruptly as we found ourselves in the forefront of an incoming attack. Our lookouts were shocked to discover a swarm of German tanks and infantry coming out of the Rodenhof Valley, headed directly toward us. It looked to be at least a full battalion attack with double tank support. Those monsters crunched over the snow with ease, with some of their infantry riding on the tanks, some following. They clanked along relentlessly right out in the open, as though they didn't care whether we saw them or not. They looked like a bunch of steamrollers to us. A chill went down my spine, and my scalp tightened as though my hair was standing on end. After a second's initial paralysis, I grabbed the radio and reported the attack to Colonel Kennan. I asked that he clear all radio channels to the artillery. He wished me luck and immediately ordered everyone else off the air. Next, I sent the invaluable Lloyd, then my only officer, up front about 50 yards with a walkie-talkie to be our forward observer. Then I got out the map and radioed to artillery the numbers of the pre-arranged targets that covered the Rodenhof Valley. From then on, Lloyd and I became spectators to the greatest show ever. It seemed like only a minute before we heard over our heads the sibilant gurgle of shells ploughing through the air. Ah, but it was such sweet music. Moments later, we saw the electric flash and quick spumes of smoke and debris as the 105 and 155 shells landed among the enemy. When I had earlier called our 105 artillery battery and given them the map coordinates for targets to our front, it apparently passed the coordinates on to the Division 155mm Long Toms, 4.2mm mortars, and the Cannon Company. Later, when I requested fire on a particular target number, all units laid on salvo after salvo. A salvo called for each gun in a battery to rapid-fire 4 rounds, i.e. 16 rounds from each battery on each target. In addition, H Company's forward observer, Sergeant Smith, directed his 81mm mortars at any target he saw. As the Germans moved about trying to avoid our artillery, I just called in another number. Within moments, fire was screaming down on them. It was a dose of Hurtgen hell for the Germans, but we were almost savagely ecstatic as we enjoyed every moment while our artillery shelled them. Artillery at its best was flying in the right direction, and even though some of those rounds seemed to rock our treetops in their passing, we were too happy to care. To us, the artillery strike was more deliverance than conquest. Those people could have killed us all. They had overwhelming strength. Without even bazookas and with only our rifles, our position was both helpless and hopeless. Hundreds and hundreds of explosives had hit those krauts, and I didn't see how they could take much more. After 15 or 20 minutes, they gave up and pulled back out of view and out of range. Ours was the deepest gratitude for our artillery, and when Colonel Keenan and the artillery commander later called us, we told them our feelings. It was great to have a team. During that night and the next one, we heard the clanging noise of horses and wagons going out into the battle area to collect the dead and wounded, and probably to salvage whatever equipment they could. Actually, the tending of wounded had begun as soon as the shelling had stopped, with the German medics and stretcher-bearers getting right out there. Anyone left on the field overnight would have frozen to death. Meanwhile, our 4.2 Nm and 80mm mortars continued to shell Rodenhof and set several buildings on fire. The Germans never seemed to give up, and soon they began to shell us again. This time the target was Osweiler, where they must have known our headquarters to be. They were not using ordinary artillery, but rather the 6-barreled rockets that quickly earned the name Screaming Mimes. These spine-chilling things were launched with a piercingly shrill, eerie screech that by itself scared the devil out of us. The awful sound carried for miles, it seemed, and was so widespread we couldn't pinpoint its source of trajectory, though we knew it must have arced up pretty high. The new German rockets were larger than our 155mm shells. They had an awful wallop and were causing havoc for Colonel Keenan and his people. He had to keep moving his headquarters from cellar to cellar, and once took a direct hit, but was saved by a reinforced concrete basement. The colonel was fed up with the murderous things, and one night he radioed us to ask if we had any inkling where those damned rockets were coming from. Lloyd and I already had a pretty good idea, because we had been watching the sparks from their tail assemblies as they streaked overhead. We had also seen their muzzle flash, and I had taken compass readings and timed it from the first flash to the explosion in Osweiler. Colonel Kennan was delighted and asked if we'd like to take a shot at them. He said he'd talked to division artillery and that they'd put some Long Toms, 155mm artillery, at his disposal when he had a target. The next time the Krauts fired their rockets, Lieutenant Lloyd timed them, while I took a reading on the flash, using a couple of trees to line up the direction for my compass. The artillery commanding officer used the time we gave him, drew an arc on his map, and estimated the target in the vicinity of Echternach, about 2 miles distant. I then suggested he fire a few rounds of white phosphorus. I lined up my trees again to get the target, and while I could see the explosive flash from the Long Tom's smoke, the firing angle was such that I couldn't tell if they were on target. After a few rounds at different distances, I felt they were pretty close, so I told the commanding officer to fire for effect, i.e., each gun in a battery of 4 guns was to fire 4 rounds on the same target. All those big shells began exploding just about where we figured we had seen the muzzle flashes, and I yelled, "Bullseye!" The long toms continued to pour it on for several minutes. Those big guns must have fired 4 or 5 times the usual salvos. I wouldn't have wanted to be on the receiving end of all that. Of course, we never did really see those rocket launchers, and I don't know how close the long toms came. But if they didn't hit anything, they sure must have scared those Krauts, because there was no more firing on Osweiler, to Colonel Keenan's great satisfaction. During the morning of December 24th, we received the delightful news that a combat team from the 5th Infantry Division would be coming up to relieve us. We were ordered to change our radio frequency to their channel so we could speak directly to them. This led to something of a comedy of errors, because our battalion call letters were the same as theirs. And every time I tried to reach my battalion, the 5th Division people were convinced we were clever English-speaking Germans. As a result, frantic calls kept interrupting us to tell the battalion to ignore our sabotaging calls. Finally, on Christmas Eve, we were replaced, and my frozen, exhausted men happily marched the quarter-mile back to Osweiler. To us, it was the best possible Christmas present. There we packed the entire company, all 23 of us, on one 2.5-ton truck and my jeep, and we moved back some 2.5 miles to the little village of Berberg that we'd come through earlier. It didn't seem much like Christmas Eve. There were no Christmas lights at all in the settlement, no lighted Christmas trees, not a cheerful note or carol in the air. We moved quietly into unheated, deserted buildings, and were grateful to be out of the wind and snow. And then, marvel of marvels, our cooks had arrived ahead of us and provided a nice warm meal with plenty of hot coffee. After dinner, the men were trying to get settled in various houses, and I was reading some mail from home by candlelight when Christmas came early, and Providence gave us an enormous present: 100 new men and 3 new officers. Several trucks delivered the new replacements, raw recruits direct from skimpy basic training, and 3 partially trained officers. The officers were all emergency transfers into the infantry from other branches. They had been given 2 weeks basic training, then declared infantry officers. They were nice guys, and I hoped they would live long enough to discover what the infantry was really about and not take too many men down with them while they were learning. It was bad enough to be a green frontline officer, I knew, but to be green to the infantry as well must have been hell. They had been trained in anti-aircraft or other army branches, and so were not familiar with infantry procedures. It was as if they didn't speak the same language of the rest of us. The enlisted men were even worse off, for only a little over 6 weeks before they had been civilians. After 5 weeks of condensed basic infantry training at Camp Blanding, Florida, and a week on trains, ships and trucks, they had been thrown out into the cold at Christmas time. Lieutenant Lloyd and I divided up the new men among the new officers and assigned everyone places for the night. This took several hours, and we didn't bother trying to do any more than get them all bedded down. Our great cooks, meanwhile, worked through the night to surprise us with a full-scale Christmas dinner with all the trimmings. It was almost too rich for those of us accustomed to K rations. Some of us ate too much. I don't know how the cooks managed to include all the new men, but they did, and we complimented them. The replacements had been thrown into the breach so unprepared because of the Army's crippling, debilitating losses in the Bulge. We discovered that these men had been on the rifle range only once. They had never thrown a grenade or fired a bazooka, mortar, or machine gun. Company F was in deep trouble. It was tough enough sending thoroughly trained men into combat. When I thought of all the training and experience I'd been blessed with, if that's the word, I was sick about those poor men. Lieutenant Lloyd and I talked it over and decided that, even though we were in reserve and were supposed to be recuperating, we had no time for rest. It would be suicidal to take those men into battle. We had to give them some intensive training while we had the chance. So we had the supply sergeant scrounge up several extra boxes of .30 caliber ammo, hand grenades, bazookas and mortar shells. We set up our own firing ranges, and everybody, including the new officers, got a chance to fire a rifle, throw a live grenade, shoot a bazooka shell, and try out a machine gun and a 60mm mortar. Then we had classes and work sessions on the absolutely essential basics. We told the men how important their foxholes were for survival, that they had to start digging in almost every time they stopped. We talked about how to protect against tree bursts, about the care of feet. In short, we reviewed all the tricks we had learned about survival in battle. We also got into how to use fire and movement in attack, and the great importance of grenades in close action. The men responded well, being keen to learn and eager to try out all the weapons. We used up a lot of ammo, but that wasn't as important as saving lives. Lloyd and I did not see how we could have done without this interlude of intensive training, and each new officer told me privately how much he appreciated it. While none of the new men was in top condition, one had a physical handicap that I thought was just too much, so I sent him to the rear despite his protests. I admired his spirit and assured him they needed good men back there. The guy had a birth defect in his right shoulder that prevented his raising his rifle more than belt high. One side effect of having so many green men was that our non-battle casualties, NBCs, rate began to rise. Our first loss was that of a man whose rifle fell over while he was going to the latrine. The bullet ripped a hole in his thigh. It is difficult to imagine how this could have happened, but there were no witnesses, and we had to take his word. Rumours are an inevitable part of army life. One that came along seemed to have official backing, and it put us a little on edge. We were warned to be on the lookout for English-speaking Germans dressed in American uniforms. We were to challenge any strange Americans at all, asking for the password, which was changed more frequently than usual. We were to ask questions about baseball and politics, things the average GI would know. The ersatz Americans were said to be spies parachuted behind the lines. None of them showed up in our zone. However, they did show up and cause a lot of problems near Bastogne, where they directed traffic onto the wrong roads, blew up bridges, etc.